It started like any other day, the kind where you wake up feeling like the world is in your corner. The sun peeked through my curtains, my favorite mug was waiting on the counter for a steaming cup of coffee, and I had just checked my savings account before heading to work. $62,000. Every single penny had been carefully saved over years of long hours and disciplined budgeting. That money wasn't just a number to me, it was freedom. It was my escape plan from the monotony of spreadsheets and tax codes, the key to opening my dream cafe. I'd had the idea for years, sketching menus and imagining the warm, inviting atmosphere I'd create. A little slice of happiness, tucked into a quiet corner of the city. But dreams have a funny way of slipping through your fingers when you least expect it. I worked as an accountant for a construction company called Golden Ridge. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid well enough, and I liked the stability. My boss, Greg Hastings, was one of those people you couldn't help but notice. He walked into a room and owned it, flashing his perfect smile and cracking jokes that made everyone laugh, even if they weren't funny. Greg had a presence about him. He always looked the part, sharp suits, slick back hair, and a Rolex that glinted under the fluorescent lights. People gravitated toward him, trusted him, even when they shouldn't. Looking back, I realized that charm was Greg's weapon. He wielded it like a blade, cutting through people's defenses without them ever realizing it. But at the time, I didn't see the danger. I only saw the man who signed my paychecks, the one who occasionally asked me about my cafe plans as if he cared. "Sarah," he'd said one Friday, leaning against the doorway to my office. "You're the kind of person who makes things happen. I know you'll get that cafe off the ground someday. I mean, it's written all over you. You're a doer." It was flattering, I'll admit. And maybe that's why, when Greg called me into his office a few months later, I didn't think twice. He was sitting behind his massive mahogany desk, leaning back in his chair like a king on his throne. Papers were spread out in front of him, and his expression was unusually serious. "Sarah," he began, folding his hands together. "I need your help." I sat down, caught off guard by his tone. Greg wasn't the type to admit needing help. "The company's in a tight spot," he continued. "It's nothing major, just some short-term cash flow issues. You know how these things go in construction. Payments don't always come through when they're supposed to, and it's causing some hiccups with a big contract we're trying to secure." I nodded, even though I didn't fully understand. I handled the books, but I wasn't privy to all the ins and outs of the business. "We're so close to landing this deal," Greg said, leaning forward. "And when we do, it'll be a game changer. I'm talking millions in revenue, enough to not only pull us out of this rough patch but to grow the company tenfold." "That sounds great," I said, still unsure why he was telling me all this. He smiled, the kind of smile that made you feel like you were in on a secret. "Here's where you come in. We need some short-term liquidity to finalize the deal. Just a bridge to get us over the hump." And I thought, who better to trust than my own team? I mean, we're a family here, right? I felt a slight tug of unease but forced a polite nod. "So," Greg continued, "I'm offering a unique opportunity. Employees can invest their personal savings into the company, temporarily, to help secure this deal. And I'm not just asking you to do this out of loyalty, though I know you're loyal, Sarah. I'm offering a 20% return. That's right, 20% in 3 months." He let the number hang in the air like bait on a hook. 20%? I asked, incredulous. He nodded. "It's a win-win. The company gets the boost we need, and you get a nice little payday. Plus, Sarah, think about what that could mean for your cafe fund. An extra $12,000, just like that." He knew exactly how to play me. My stomach flipped at the thought of what I could do with that money: upgraded equipment, better furniture, a bigger space. It felt too good to be true. Still, I hesitated. "I don't know, Greg. That's my entire savings. If something goes wrong. Nothing will go wrong, he interrupted, his voice warm and reassuring. I'd stake my reputation on it. I've done this before, Sarah, and it's always worked out. I wouldn't offer this if I didn't believe in it. You're smart, you know a good opportunity when you see one. I should have walked away then and there. I should have listened to the voice in the back of my mind, the one that whispered warnings I couldn't quite make out. But Greg's confidence was intoxicating, and the promise of that extra money was too tempting. By the end of the day, I had transferred $62,000 into the company's account. The first few weeks passed uneventfully. I kept my head down, focusing on work and reassuring myself that everything would be fine. But as the 3-month mark approached, I started to get nervous. Greg hadn't mentioned anything about returning the money, and I didn't want to seem pushy. When the day finally came, I knocked on his office door, my heart pounding. Greg, I was wondering about the investment, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. You said we'd see a return today. He looked up from his computer and smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Oh, right. About that, it's going to be just a little longer. The contract hit a minor delay, but it's nothing to worry about. Trust me, Sarah, you'll get your money soon. And with interest, of course. I nodded, forcing a smile, but the knot in my stomach tightened. Weeks turned into months. Every time I asked, Greg had a new excuse. The contract was delayed again. The client hadn't paid yet. The funds were tied up in processing. And then, one Monday morning, I walked into the office and felt like I'd been punched in the gut. The place was empty. Desks, computers, office supplies, everything was gone. It was like the company had vanished overnight. I frantically called Greg, but his phone went straight to voicemail. His email bounced back as undeliverable. I wasn't the only one in shock. Coworkers started flooding the group chat with messages. Is this a joke? What's going on? Where's Greg? The answer came a few days later when the company's bankruptcy filing hit the news. Greg had cleaned out the accounts and disappeared, leaving behind a trail of unpaid bills, angry investors, and devastated employees. I was shattered. My savings, my future, was gone. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't think about anything except the betrayal. How could I have been so stupid? How could I have trusted him? But as the weeks dragged on, my despair began to harden into something else. Something darker. Anger. Greg had stolen from me, from all of us, and he thought he could get away with it. But he didn't know me as well as he thought he did. I wasn't going to let this slide. I was going to make him pay. I had no idea where to start. It's not like there's a guidebook for taking down a con artist. For weeks, I felt lost, stewing in my anger, replaying every interaction I'd had with Greg. Every fake smile, every reassuring word, every lie. I went through stages, self-blame, regret, rage, but eventually, I realized there was only one way forward, action. First, I needed to know more. Greg might have been slick, but no one pulls a scam like this without leaving breadcrumbs. I started by combing through everything I could find on the company. Old emails, financial reports, contracts, anything that might give me a lead. It wasn't easy. Greg had always kept me and the other employees in the dark about the bigger picture. But I was determined. Then I remembered something, a document I'd stumbled across months before. It was a random file Greg had accidentally emailed to me instead of our legal department. At the time, I didn't think much of it, but now, it seemed like a potential goldmine. I searched my personal drive and found it buried in an old folder. When I opened the file, my jaw dropped. It was a bank statement, not for the company, but for an account under a different name. The transactions were eye-popping. Money was being funneled out of the company into this account, tens of thousands of dollars at a time. And the name on the account? G. Harwood. Who was G. Harwood? Was it Greg? A fake identity? Someone else entirely? The more I stared at the document, the more questions I had. But one thing was clear, this account was where my money had gone. I decided to dig deeper into this G. Harwood. Late nights became my new normal. I spent hours researching online, looking for any connection between Greg and this alias. Social media profiles, business listings, public records, I scoured everything I could think of. For weeks, I found nothing. It was like chasing a ghost. Then, one night, I hit pay dirt. I found a small business registration in Florida under the name G. Harwood. The address listed: a luxury condo in Miami Beach. My heart raced. Was this where Greg was hiding? It seemed too good to be true, but I wasn't about to let this lead slip away. I didn't have much experience with investigations, so I reached out to someone who did. A friend of mine, Rachel, had once worked as a paralegal and knew a thing or two about digging into people's pasts. When I told her what had happened, she didn't even hesitate. "Send me everything you've got," she said. "We'll find this guy." Rachel worked fast. Within days, she uncovered more dirt on Greg than I thought possible. Fake business names, unpaid debts, lawsuits, he had a trail of destruction stretching back years. But what shocked me most was what she found about his personal life. Greg had a wife and 2 kids. Or at least, he had them. Turns out, he'd left them years ago, skipping out on child support and disappearing entirely. I couldn't believe it. Greg had always acted like he was above reproach, like he was untouchable. But here he was, living a double, or maybe triple, life, leaving ruin in his wake. The Miami lead was looking more promising by the minute. Rachel suggested hiring a private investigator to confirm whether Greg was really there. At first, I balked at the cost. After all, I was already broke. But then I thought about everything Greg had taken from me. If there was even a chance of finding him, it was worth it. The investigator, a grizzled man named Vince, didn't ask many questions. "Send me the address," he said, his voice flat. "I'll handle the rest." 2 weeks later, Vince called me. "You were right," he said. "Your guy's living in Miami, going by the name Gavin Harwood. Got himself a fancy condo, drives a Porsche, spends his nights whining and dining at high-end restaurants. Seems he's doing just fine with everyone else's money." Hearing that made my blood boil. While I was struggling to rebuild my life, Greg, or Gavin, or whatever he wanted to call himself, was living like a king. It wasn't fair. But now, I had something I hadn't had before: leverage. The question was, what would I do with it? I thought about going straight to the police, but Rachel talked me out of it. "You need more," she said. "Right now, all you've got is circumstantial evidence. If you go to the cops, he'll just slip away again. You need to hit him where it hurts." So, I decided to build a case. I started reaching out to other people Greg had scammed, former employees, clients, investors, anyone who might have a grievance against him. At first, it was hard. Some people were too ashamed to talk about what had happened. Others were so angry they didn't want to revisit it. But slowly, I started to piece together a network of people who, like me, wanted justice. One of those people was a contractor named Miguel. He'd done work for Golden Ridge right before it went under and was owed over $100,000. I knew something was shady, he told me. But Greg was so convincing. He made me believe he'd pay me back. By the time I realized I'd been duped, it was too late. Miguel had something I didn't: documents. He'd kept meticulous records of every interaction he'd had with Greg, including contracts, emails, and payment schedules. It was exactly what I needed to start building a solid case. But the most important break came when I contacted Linda, a former investor in one of Greg's past companies. She'd lost nearly $500,000 when Greg pulled the same stunt he had with Golden Ridge. Unlike most people, Linda hadn't let it go. She'd spent years trying to track him down, even hiring a forensic accountant to trace the money. When I told her about my situation, Linda didn't hesitate. "I'll help you," she said. "I've been waiting for this for a long time." With Linda's help, I uncovered a web of shell companies Greg had set up to hide his stolen funds. He wasn't just a con artist, he was a master manipulator, moving money around so quickly it was nearly impossible to trace. But, nearly impossible, wasn't the same as impossible. Between Linda's forensic accountant, Rachel's legal expertise, and Vince's boots-on-the-ground investigation, we started to connect the dots. And the picture we painted wasn't pretty. Greg, or Gavin, or whatever alias he was using, had been running scams like this for years, using each new company to fund his extravagant lifestyle while leaving his victims in ruins. We weren't just building a case. We were building a bomb. And when we were ready, we were going to drop it right on Greg's doorstep. I stared at the thick folder sitting on my kitchen table. Inside was everything we had on Greg: fake names, bank accounts, shell companies, forged documents, and testimonies from his victims. Months of late nights, calls, and endless digging had all come down to this. It was time to make my move. Rachel and Linda had different ideas about what to do next. Rachel was pushing for a full legal assault, taking everything to the authorities and letting them handle it. But Linda, with years of frustration behind her, wanted to go scorched earth. "Expose him publicly," she said. "Drag his name through the mud, and make sure everyone knows exactly who he is." I wasn't sure which route to take. What I did know was that I needed to hit him where it would hurt the most: his wallet and his ego. This wasn't just about money anymore, it was about justice, about making Greg feel the weight of what he'd done to all of us. I decided to do both. Step 1 was the lawsuit. Linda's lawyer helped us draft a class action suit with every victim we could find. Contractors, investors, ex-employees, we all joined forces. It wasn't just about recovering what we'd lost, it was about holding Greg accountable in a way he couldn't escape. But the lawsuit was only the beginning. While that played out, I focused on my own plan: destroying Greg's new life. I started by leaking information. Using a fake email account, I sent anonymous tips to local journalists, detailing Greg's history and his current whereabouts in Miami. I attached photos Vince had taken of him living it up in his luxury condo, along with records showing how he'd stolen money to fund it. It didn't take long for the story to spread. A local business reporter picked it up first, publishing an article with the headline, "Fraudster in Paradise, Exposing Miami's Construction Con Artist." The piece laid out Greg's scams in brutal detail, naming him as a fraudster who preyed on small businesses and hardworking people. From there, the story went viral. National outlets picked it up, and Greg's face was suddenly plastered all over the news. His carefully crafted image, smooth-talking businessman, self-made success, was obliterated. People started coming out of the woodwork to share their stories about him. Social media exploded with outrage, with comments like, "I worked for this guy. He owes me 2 months of pay. This man ruined my father's business. Glad to see him exposed. Hope they lock him up for good this time." But I wasn't done yet. Greg's condo in Miami was the crown jewel of his new life, the symbol of everything he'd stolen from us. So I decided to take it away. Using the information Linda's accountant had uncovered, I tracked down the condo's landlord. Turns out, Greg hadn't been paying rent for months, relying instead on excuses and small partial payments to keep the landlord at bay. Armed with that information, I sent the landlord proof of Greg's real identity, along with the viral news articles exposing him as a scam artist. It didn't take long for the landlord to act. Within days, Greg was evicted. Vince called me the morning it happened, his voice laced with satisfaction. He looked furious, Vince said, laughing. Like someone had just stolen his favorite toy. They tossed his Porsche onto a flatbed and threw his stuff out on the curb. He didn't even try to fight it, just grabbed a duffel bag and stormed off. I could picture it so clearly, and for the first time in months, I felt a flicker of satisfaction. But the real blow came when the FBI finally stepped in. All those documents we'd gathered, all those accounts we'd traced, they painted a picture of a man who had been laundering money and committing fraud for over a decade. Linda and I handed everything over to the authorities, and within weeks, Greg was officially under investigation. When the agents finally caught up with him, Greg didn't go quietly. He tried to play the same smooth-talking game he always did, claiming it was all a misunderstanding, that he'd been working on repaying everyone. But the evidence was overwhelming. I wasn't there when they cuffed him, but I got the play-by-play from Vince, who somehow managed to be in the right place at the right time. They nabbed him at a restaurant, Vince told me. He was sitting there, all smug, sipping a $200 glass of wine, when the agents walked in. The look on his face when they put the cuffs on. Priceless. The news broke that same night. Headlines blared, Miami fraudster arrested in multi-million-dollar scam. Photos of Greg being led out of the restaurant in handcuffs flooded the internet, and the public's reaction was swift. But for me, it wasn't just about seeing Greg arrested. It was about knowing that justice was finally catching up to him. In the weeks that followed, the FBI continued to uncover more of Greg's schemes. Bank records, offshore accounts, fake business licenses, it was like peeling back the layers of an onion, each more rotten than the last. And while all of this was happening, the lawsuit moved forward. Linda's lawyer made sure it was airtight, and by the time Greg's assets were frozen, there was more than enough to start repaying his victims. I got my first check a few months later. It wasn't the full $62,000, I knew I might never see all of it, but it was enough to make a difference. Enough to help me start over. But money wasn't the only thing I got back. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt like I could breathe again. Like I wasn't defined by what Greg had taken from me. And that's when I realized something, the best revenge isn't just about tearing someone else down. It's about rebuilding yourself. Months passed, and life slowly began to feel normal again. With Greg in custody, the lawsuits underway, and the FBI unraveling the full extent of his schemes, it felt like I could finally move on. I even allowed myself to dream again. My cafe idea was back on track, and though the process was slower than I had imagined years ago, I was determined to make it happen. But just when I thought the Greg saga was over, a phone call shattered that illusion. It was Rachel, her voice tense. "Sarah, you need to see this. Check your email." My heart sank. After everything, what now? I opened my laptop and clicked on the attachment Rachel had sent. It was a court document, a filing from Greg's attorney. Apparently, Greg was negotiating a plea deal with the FBI, but that wasn't the shocking part. Buried in the document was the name of a new account Greg had disclosed as part of his plea bargain. It was offshore, tucked away in the Cayman Islands. And the balance? $3.8 million. Are you kidding me? I muttered under my breath. How had Greg managed to hide so much money for so long? The man was a cockroach, surviving in the cracks even when everything around him crumbled. But that wasn't the most scandalous part. As I read further, I saw a name I didn't expect. Greg had listed a co-owner of the account, a woman named Laura Hastings. I froze. Laura Hastings? Greg's wife? I remembered what Rachel had uncovered months ago, that Greg had left his wife and kids years earlier. At the time, it seemed like just another footnote in his long list of betrayals. But this new revelation made me question everything. Was Laura really out of his life, or had she been part of his schemes all along? Rachel called again, breaking my train of thought. "Did you see it?" she asked. "Yeah," I said, my voice shaking. "Do you think she was in on it?" "Hard to say," Rachel replied. "But if she was, it changes everything. It means this wasn't just Greg's operation, it was a partnership. The thought sent a chill down my spine. Had Greg and Laura been running these scams together? Had she been playing the long game, pretending to be a victim while secretly profiting from his crimes? I had to know the truth. Through Linda's lawyer, I managed to track down Laura's contact information. She was living in a modest house in Colorado, a far cry from Greg's flashy Miami lifestyle. I decided to reach out, not expecting much. To my surprise, Laura agreed to meet with me. When I arrived at her house, I was struck by how ordinary she seemed, soft-spoken, dressed in a simple sweater and jeans. It was hard to reconcile her with the image of a criminal mastermind. "Why are you here?" she asked, her tone wary. I didn't mince words. "I want to know if you were involved. The offshore account in the Caymans, it has your name on it." Her face went pale. For a moment, I thought she might deny everything, but then she surprised me. "Come in," she said quietly. Once inside, Laura poured us both a cup of coffee and sat across from me at her dining table. "I didn't know about the account," she began. "At least, not at first. Greg added my name to it without telling me. He said it was for tax reasons, and I believed him. But then, as time went on, I started noticing things, money coming in that didn't make sense, documents he'd ask me to sign without explaining them." Her voice wavered, and she looked down at her hands. When I finally confronted him, he told me everything. About the scams, the fake companies, all of it. He said he was doing it for us, for our family. But by then, I couldn't stand to look at him. "So you left," I said. She nodded. "I took the kids and went. But I didn't go to the police. I was too scared. Greg said if I ever turned on him, he'd ruin me, drag my name through the mud. And the worst part? He wasn't bluffing. He kept records of everything, even things I didn't do. If I spoke up, he'd make it look like I was just as guilty as he was." Her story was convincing, but something about it didn't sit right. "If that's true, why hasn't he used those records now? Why didn't he drag you into this when he was arrested?" Laura's lips tightened. "Because I have leverage too," she admitted. "What kind of leverage?" I asked. She hesitated, then reached into a nearby drawer and pulled out a stack of papers. "These," she said, sliding them across the table. I scanned the documents, my eyes widening as I realized what I was looking at. They were signed contracts, emails, and handwritten notes, proof that Greg had been working with someone even higher up. Someone who wasn't just scamming people but laundering money for organized crime. This is huge," I whispered. Laura nodded. "That's why I couldn't go to the police. Greg wasn't just running small-time scams. He was working for people who don't take kindly to loose ends. If they find out I have these, or that I've been talking to you," she trailed off, her fear palpable. Suddenly, the stakes felt much higher. Greg wasn't just a con artist, he was a pawn in something much bigger. And now, by digging into his life, I had put myself in the crosshairs. "What are you going to do with this?" I asked, gesturing to the papers. "I don't know," Laura admitted. "If I hand it over to the FBI, it could blow the case wide open. But it could also put my kids in danger. And if Greg finds out I still have this." We sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of the situation pressing down on both of us. In the end, I left Laura's house with more questions than answers. I couldn't stop thinking about what she'd shown me, about the larger forces at play. Had Greg been a victim too, in his own twisted way? Or was he just a man who had finally gone too far, dragging everyone down with him? The cafe opened 6 months later. I named it Second Chances, just as I'd planned. From the outside, everything looked perfect, smiling customers, the smell of fresh coffee, sunlight streaming through the windows. But inside, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. Because somewhere out there, Greg was still scheming. Laura was still hiding. And those shadowy figures Greg had worked for, they weren't going to disappear quietly. Justice had been served, but the story wasn't finished. Some battles end with a bang, others leave you waiting for the next strike. And I had a feeling this was far from the end.